power. And they're going to share that with you right now with some actions. Okay?
Psalms 104, verse 1. Oh, Lord my God, you are very great.
Nice.
Good job, guys. And we're going to try to incorporate, of course, this is Family Sunday, which means, of course, it's also the same day as Brunch Sunday. And then as well, the young people stay up here with us instead of going down into junior worship. And so we're going to try to get back in the habit of incorporating them doing something with us like this on this particular Sunday morning, which is the first Sunday morning of every month. If you're a first-timer here at Parkview Christian Church, if you haven't been here before, we want to encourage you to stick around. We do have a brunch afterwards. This brunch in general is used to help us in gaining funds that helps us do the benevolent work that is done on Mondays, the handing out of groceries. And so we encourage you, if you're visiting with us, just plan on staying with us and enjoying it, and we can get to know you a little bit better. If you're thinking about or looking for a place, we'd love to get to share with you all the many things that are happening around Parkview Christian Church. So we're glad you're here with us, if that's the case. This morning, I want to look at a lesson, and it's not the one that's on the back of the bulletin. Toward the latter part of last week, I began to realize that that's not the one that I wanted to preach. Does it say counterfeit on there? I'll tell you why it says counterfeit on there, because I'm not going to preach that sermon. I mean, even later on, I don't think I'm going to preach that sermon. It says counterfeit because at the dog wash, what's it been, a couple of weeks ago, the dog wash, three weeks, we got a counterfeit $10 bill donated to us. And I'm sure that whoever passed the $10 bill had no idea that it was counterfeit. Sarah had counted the money, I had counted the money, and didn't notice it. But when the bank teller said, "Do you ever check your bills?" well, she laid it down there, and immediately I thought I should have known. I mean, you could tell that it was counterfeit. But I thought, well, I'm gonna use that in a lesson, but as every time, if you start with an illustration and then try to build a lesson around it, it just doesn't work. God is not in it, and He wasn't in it, and I couldn't make that work. There are a lot of things that we could look at for counterfeit, as far as false teachers and things like that. But those kind of things happen. It doesn't mean that we have to use it for an illustration. And sometimes teachers or those who are preaching, you want to latch on to something, that'll really stick in people's minds, and so they can remember a point. And I really thought I wanted to use it, but it wasn't working. And I believe fully what we're going to look at today is something that God wants us to look at today. He could have, but He didn't. He could have, but He didn't. And you will probably think of a dozen things that I'm not going to go to as we begin looking at these things together. But when we think about Jesus, some of the things that He could have done that He didn't do. One of the things that first hit my mind, and if you want to turn to Matthew chapter 4, this passage is a passage that talks about the temptations of Jesus. And don't think when we say this is the temptation of Jesus that this is the only time that Jesus was tempted. We know that He learned suffering It was something, according to Hebrews, that he learned in becoming flesh, becoming one of us. In going through the things that he did, Hebrews also tells us he was tempted in all points, like as we are, yet without sin. And so if you look at Matthew chapter 4, and I know that you can kind of break this down to the various types of sin and look at these three incidents, whether it be the pride of life or the lust of the eye or the lust of the flesh, these things within these three temptations that are there, and yet I don't think that we see Jesus being made like us and being tempted in all points like as we are, and that this would have been his only time of temptation. Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, we know that he was in anguish and even praying to his Father, what? Not my will, but thine, as he's closing from saying, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. I don't know that was a moment of temptation, but he was seeking a way out, if it were possible. But then yielding it up to the Father, not my will, but thine. But in Matthew chapter 4, and it's one of the first places my mind went to, beginning in verse 1, it says, Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil, and after he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he then became hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread. But he answered and said, It is written, Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Then the devil took him into the holy city, and he had him stand on the pinnacle of the temple, and said to him, If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will give his angels charge concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. Jesus said to him, On the other hand it is written, You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Again the devil took him to a very high mountain, and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, and he said to him, All these things will I give you, if you fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, Begone, Satan. For it is written, You shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Jesus could have, but he didn't. If Jesus could take 5 loaves and 2 fish and feed a multitude of people, he could have changed stones to bread. It wouldn't have been that much different than changing water to wine. Jesus he had the power to manipulate molecules to cause them to become something that they were not. Even to take flesh that was dead and to give it life. He could have done this, and he could have satisfied himself. But had he chosen to use the ability to do that just for himself, wouldn't he have given up a portion of being mankind? There were many occasions in which he chose to do that, but to do it for somebody else, not for himself. Jesus could have thrown himself down from the pinnacle of the temple. It wasn't in the plan for him to die by smashing into the ground. But he was to hang on a tree. It was even prophesied that his hands and his feet would be pierced, that his appearance would be marred. I mean, these things were said of the Messiah so long before he ever came. And so even the thought of that, well, there's no way I'm going to die if I jump off the top of the temple. It wouldn't matter the angels will save me. And think about the glory that you would have had for eternity past. You know, we think of eternity most of the time as forward, but eternity past, Jesus, not the one who became flesh, but Jesus, the Son of God, nonetheless. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. There was nothing that was created that was not created by Him and for Him. And so His work even in creation, and so you see eternity past and the recognition of Him as God, not an angel, but as God. And He's used to that. You know, it's one thing if somebody puts you up on a pedestal and they recognize you in some way. They recognize your accomplishments. They recognize who you are. Well, once you become used to that, when it's taken away, then it stings a little bit. If you're used to a position, if you're used to having earned maybe something that gets you some kind of recognition, and then that is gone. But if you've never had that, then when it happens, you might enjoy that moment, but not necessarily expecting it to continue. With Jesus, think about what He gave up. Think about the recognition that He gave up. He was here. He was a man. He was walking among people. He grew up a carpenter's son. But think about what He had given up. So Satan taking Him and saying, just cast yourself off. The angels will be at your beck and call. And then even Satan showing Him the kingdoms of the world. Just bow down to me and they'll all be yours. Because honestly, don't the kingdoms worship Satan? I mean, to some degree, we see the world, those who are not gods, those who follow, even as it's said of Satan, the prince of the power of the air. And so just bow down and worship me, and I'll give you all of this. I know I've mentioned this before, but you know, from what James tells us about temptation, it's when we're carried away and enticed by our own desires, and then when temptation is given into, it becomes sin. So temptation itself is not sin. It's when we give into that. But temptation has to do with desires. If these things were not desires of Jesus, they wouldn't have been temptations. Jesus didn't come free from the desires that we have of the flesh, desires of our life, desires even of pride, of physical want. All of these things that we experience temptation, Jesus Himself experienced. In these three occasions, we do see those. But we see Jesus having the ability to do all of these things that we couldn't do, and so even probably greater temptations than we will ever have. He could have, but He didn't. Turn with me to John chapter 11, if you will. John chapter 11, because there are instances where people basically make this statement to Jesus Himself, but from a different perspective. The first part of the chapter of John chapter 11, we're really kind of introduced to a man named Lazarus. He was Lazarus of Bethany, and Mary and Martha were his sisters. And we find out that Lazarus is sick, and word comes to Jesus that Lazarus is sick. It says in verse 4, but when Jesus heard it, He said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of Man may be glorified by it. It says, verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. When therefore He heard that he was sick, He stayed then 2 days longer in the place he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, "Let us go to Judea." Now, his disciples are afraid that he's going to go and that he's going to be attacked because the attacks have already been coming. And so it says, in verse 8, the disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. And if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him." This he said, and after that he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go that I may awaken him out of sleep." The disciples therefore said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of literal sleep. Then Jesus therefore said to them plainly, "Lazarus is dead." Jesus knew. Now Jesus had waited 2 days before going to Lazarus. Jesus has already healed other people. People have witnessed this, and Mary and Martha, knowing that Jesus has the ability to heal, sends word to Jesus thinking he'll come right away because Lazarus is his friend. He'll be here. He can save him. Now look at verse 17. So when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary still sat in the house. Martha, therefore, said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother shall rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall live, even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" Jesus is having this conversation with Martha, and she said, "If you would have been here, he wouldn't have died." Jesus could have, but he didn't. He could have saved him from dying, but he didn't. That was Martha's point. Jesus said, "Your brother will rise again." She said, "I know he will. I believe in the resurrection. I know that he will rise again in the resurrection." Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall never die." He asked her, "Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world." And when she had said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she arose quickly and was coming to him. Now Jesus, verse 30, had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. The Jews then, who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary rose up quickly and went out, followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." They both have exactly the same first words to Jesus, saying basically, you could have, but you didn't. If you would have been here, we sent word to you. If you would have been, my brother would not have died. And remember what Jesus said back at the first of this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Is Jesus just oblivious to the fact that Lazarus is going to die? No, not at all. He delayed going. It wasn't because he was afraid. It wasn't because, they had been seeking to stone him, because 2 days later he did go. Had nothing to do with trying to dodge around the Jews stoning him. Jesus wasn't afraid of that. But the sickness wasn't unto death, because that's not the end. Even as it's not the end for us, Jesus makes some statements there that he even goes on further, "And everyone," in verse 26, "who lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this? Jesus is talking about a death that's beyond even what we probably comprehend. We know so very little about physical death, really, except for we know the Spirit's not there anymore. There's a separation that takes place. But then when we recognize spiritual death, separation from God, that didn't happen with Lazarus. So Mary's coming out and she says the same thing to him. I'm not going to read the rest of this, not this chapter. The end of the story is that even when Jesus goes to the tomb, I mean, the words are coming out, it's been 4 days. You don't want to do this. He says, move the stone. Jesus, it's been 4 days. Move the stone. Words coming out. And you wonder how he said it. Was it, as we hear sometimes, that loud, Lazarus, come forth! And he wakes up. He says, unbind him. Or was it just a general, Lazarus, come forth? Nonetheless, death wasn't the end of what was happening here. Jesus could have kept him from dying, but he didn't. Matthew chapter 26. If you want to turn over there with me. The Jews were planning on killing Jesus. They schemed and they came up with a plot that would work. A way that they could trap him, a way that they could secure even that there would be some witnesses that would speak against him, that they could have basically a mock trial, not one that would have been the norm, and he would deserve death. They could even use the Romans to participate, to nail him to a cross. After Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he said it was time and they could hear the group approaching that were coming to arrest him. There's several, and depending upon which gospel you look at, several different things that happen all at once. But beginning in verse 48, it says, Now he who was betraying him gave them a sign, saying, Whomever I shall kiss, he is the one, seize him. Verse 49, And immediately he went to Jesus and said, Hail, Rabbi, and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, Friend, do what you have come for. Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, Put your sword back in its place. For all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then shall the Scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen this way? And at that time Jesus said to the multitudes, Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as against a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the Scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled. Then all the disciples left him and fled. Peter, put back your sword. Don't you know that I could ask my Father, I could pray to my Father, and immediately I would be sent 12 legions of angels? Actually, more than. You know, I'm not sure of the significance of 12 here. There were 12 of them. Judas, now a betrayer, was on the opposite side of things. So maybe even counting himself. I mean, here's 12 to fight against how many that's come up to arrest him? Peter draws his sword. Don't you know that I could call 12 legions? There's a little bit of discrepancy of what a legion is. I mean, you can, as far as in the Roman army, and that's probably what he was talking about as far as when he would use the word legion, their mind would probably go to that first. The Roman army was really divided up in a different way than had been done before, and the major units were the legions. And pretty much the thought is that there were 6,000 men in a legion. If you go with that number, and even if you go with less, I mean, it ranges from like 3,500 up to 6,000. Different numbers that are in there, but if you go with the 6,000, that's 72,000 angels coming. Don't you know that I could call to my Father and He would send 12 legions of angels? Nobody would have to draw a sword, Peter. The 12 that would be fighting would be legions of angels fighting. Jesus could have, but He didn't. Because He then says, but then how would the Scripture be fulfilled? Matthew chapter 27, just a chapter over, the trial's taking place. They've crucified Jesus. He's hanging there on the cross, and in verse 39, and those passing by were hurling abuse at Him, wagging their heads and saying, you who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. And in the same way the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking Him and saying, He saved others, He cannot save Himself. He is the King of Israel. Let Him come down from the cross, and we shall believe in Him. He trusts in God. Let Him deliver Him, if He takes pleasure in Him. For He said, I am the Son of God, and the robbers also who had been crucified with Him were casting the same insult at Him. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. Jesus, but He didn't. If the praise team wants to be making their way up here, they can. I want to ask now for you, before any music starts, and maybe there's even some response. What is it that you have been wondering why Jesus doesn't do it? Why doesn't God just do this? Without answering. If you've been asking the question, why doesn't God do this? For whatever thing. If you've been asking that question at all, raise your hand. Okay. If you've ever asked that question, raise your hand. Okay. Job asked it a lot. It didn't mean that he wasn't patient with God. because God says He was patient. But if we're looking for that answer, in all of these instances, there was a reason, was there not? To two women who had lost a brother, trying to grapple with their belief in Jesus, which wasn't shaken, because both of them, when they went out to Him, they didn't say, "You're not who we thought you were." But they said, "If you would have been here, he wouldn't have died." They still had their faith in Jesus. Did they not? They hadn't lost that faith, but they were questioning why. Jesus didn't get angry with them. In all actuality, He cried with them. We find ourselves oftentimes asking why because we don't know why. And so we ask why. Know that He feels with us as much as He felt with them. But recognize for ourselves, for the things that we may be making the decision. I mean, if it was placed within our hands and we were getting arrested for something we hadn't done and we knew the outcome of this, we knew where this was headed, we knew that we were going to be killed over this. For a whole lot lesser things, I would probably call 12 legions of angels if I could. That's probably the reason I can't. Can you imagine? But looking at the eternity of it, looking at the plan of God, even within our lives, knowing that it's experiencing that through the things that Jesus experienced with people here. Yes, there are times in our lives when Jesus could, but He doesn't. And we need to trust. If you're here today, you need to pray together with us. You need us to pray together with you. If you need to put on Christ in baptism to begin walking the new life that says, I believe in Him, I believe in His death, I believe that He rose again. We're offering an invitation. So as we sing this together, if you have a need to come today, it's an invitation for you to come. It's not, I can't say that. I can't say it's not the final one. Because right now is all we have. If you need to come, come as we stand and sing.